Warning, this podcast discusses content which may be disturbing or triggering to individuals who have ever experienced trauma. Please take care when listening to this show and remember, this is not medical advice. If you're having thoughts of hurting yourself or someone else, please text 741-741 or call the new nationwide suicide hotline number at 988. Institutions around us create trauma within us. In this first episode, I'd like to take some time to introduce myself and introduce my background. And I'd also like to tell you what I envision for the format and frequency of the show. My name is Lacey Wilson. I have a master's degree in counseling psychology, and I've been a licensed mental health counselor in the state of Missouri since 2014. By now, I've worked a few different jobs, but in 2020, I actually opened my own private practice in my small hometown, and that has been a dream come true for me. I wanted to do it for about 4 years before I was brave enough, and everything just fell into place really nicely, and it's mine, and it's beautiful. It was a nasty old outdated tanning salon. I went there tanning in high school, and of course I never thought when I was 16 years old, this will be mine someday, and it's been successful. I've got all the clients I could possibly want because I'm the first and only therapist in my town, which is a point of pride for me because I knew the community needed it. And 2 years later, I still just beam about it and feel overwhelmed at times when I walk into it because it's just so beautiful, especially compared to what it used to be. With therapy, I'm a generalist overall. I do have experience working with families, couples, and individuals. I've done work with children's division cases, and I've also testified about 3 times, which is always a bit of a nerve-wracking experience. I do have a lot of interest, though, in trauma work and helping people to overcome trauma. I find it hopeful and exciting how curable trauma can be. That's not to say it takes away the negative things that happen to people, but rather than it being a big gaping wound, if you were to think of it as a wound on your body, trauma can become like a scar over time where you remember what happened, but it doesn't carry the same level of agony and pain, and it doesn't bother you nearly as much anymore. And I find hope in that because there are some things in mental health that they don't have very high success rates, but trauma is something that with the work, it can be very treatable. I think one of the hardest things is we get so used to pushing that trauma down that an analogy I use with kids, which is pretty gross, but they usually get it, and it actually makes a lot of sense. I ask kids, well, when you're about to throw up, it feels gross. You try to swallow it down, keep it in. You don't want it to come up. And then I always ask the kid, but what happens after you do throw up? And almost immediately they're able to tell me, well, you feel better. And so whether it's kids or adults, I use that analogy a lot because it's the same concept. If you think of it as being brave enough to throw up your emotional vomit, then you really can make a great deal of progress. I'm trained in a specific type of therapy called EMDR, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and I've actually done this therapy for myself, and I plan to do at least one, if not a couple episodes about it to be able to explain it adequately and do it justice. In those episodes, I may even share some of my experience of receiving it myself if it's relevant, but we'll see when we get there. So now I'd like to explain how I got to this podcast. I'm also working on my doctorate of clinical psychology on top of all this, and I've taken a really large interest in political psychology, and for the past 5 years, I've been studying authoritarian governments and the erosion of democracy, with my dissertation focusing on childhood trauma and susceptibility to following an authoritarian leader. I honestly never got the appeal of Donald Trump, and it kind of baffled me because I didn't see him as particularly well-spoken or educated. He was a reality star that, in my opinion, had a lot of pathology showing. As mental health therapists, we're not allowed to diagnose people we've never met, but you also get to know mental psychopathology so well that it's not hard to pinpoint certain traits and characteristics in your everyday person. There's actually a really interesting case in which a psychiatrist spoke out about what she thought was Donald Trump's psychopathology, and the APA essentially barred her from doing that. She felt as though his specific pathology fell under the duty to warn others category, as he could be an existential threat to all humans by running this country, and she eventually got fired from Yale and everything. And so I plan to talk about that at some point. And of course, if this podcast ever really does take off, I'd love to be able to interact with individuals like that. We'll see where it goes, because it's a really interesting and controversial decision no matter what. So aside from not getting the appeal of Donald Trump, I really started paying attention once children were being separated from their parents at the border, because I knew what that would do to them psychologically and developmentally, and I also knew what that would do to the parents, and it's just devastating. So I then found historians and anthropologists and political scientists and legal analysts that I sit in on their weekly Zoom chats where we can ask questions every single week. I started listening to podcasts with experts in these fields. I started reading really dry books like The Anatomy of Fascism and The Origins of Totalitarianism, and I have just completely become engrossed in all of this. In my social psychology class this past school year, I finally did a paper on how authoritarian leaders have all these followers. How does that end up happening? And it doesn't happen in a vacuum, of course, but it completely rocked my world and changed how I view everything when I realized that the susceptibility to following an authoritarian leader is not about political ideology, it's about personality traits. And when you sit and think about that for a second, at least in my mind, it just completely changes how I view everything. Perhaps some people just have an inborn drive to be the submissive follower to an authoritarian leader. And when you put that combination together along with sociopolitical things driving it, it can lead to very, very bad things. This podcast is going to focus on the many institutions within the United States which have not only failed to protect us, but have also arguably prevented us from being safe from trauma. We're going to talk about gun violence. We're going to talk about racial violence. We're going to talk about mass incarceration. We're going to talk about healthcare disparities. We're going to talk about disabilities. We're going to talk about COVID, whether it's the disease itself causing trauma, the isolation we've been through, the job loss, the lack of belonging, or just the confusion of getting the information right. There's also the mass death and the increasing political violence we could talk about. There's also the Me Too movement and the sexual assault cases. that have come about. There are so many, many, many things that are creating trauma within us. And we as a country and the world are going through mass trauma. Most of it is not our fault, but I also believe that some of it has been avoidable and no one is doing anything to protect us from it. So in this podcast, we're going to address all those things. What trauma is, the treatments for trauma, who gets trauma, the long-term and short-term impact of individual trauma, the mass trauma, and how individual trauma can spur mass trauma, the susceptibility to authoritarianism due to mass trauma, and how mentally ill individuals in positions of power can bring out trauma in society as a whole. So I'm so excited to be walking this journey with everyone. And I plan to do these episodes every 2 weeks, and I'm hoping that's not an overcommitment on my part. If it is, I will keep everybody posted and I'll let you know. These episodes will have structure, but I also want you to be able to ask questions or ask about topics you care to know more about. Most mental illness, I think, is wrapped in trauma from early childhood, and we all have traumatic things that have happened to us, even with excellent upbringings. So maybe if this takes off, I could do some live streams or some Ask Me Anythings or anything that just makes your psychological mind tick a little bit. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/US Traumapod, on Twitter at US Traumapod, or if you like what I do and feel like supporting me, I'm on patreon.com/US Traumapod. There will be some fun bonuses there if you'd like to sign up. All help is appreciated and supported as I'm really excited to get this out to you guys. Finally, I want to thank Dr. Paul Tomlinson for the theme song and for encouraging me to do this podcast. Curtis Harrington, my producer and editor. And then I'd like to give a special shout out this week to Nicole D, my first patron on Patreon, and thank you for the love and support always. All right, guys, I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.